Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our respiratory system continuation of our lecture, and we are going to start on slide 20 and not 23, on slide 67. So we're picking up in section 23.7, which is regulation of ventilation. So we have two major respiratory centers or groups within our body. First, we have our medullary respiratory center, and this is really made up of two different respiratory groups. We have our dorsal respiratory groups, which you see in the pink here, and we have two ventral respiratory groups. And these are going to be longitudinal columns, and they're bilateral, so we have them kind of on the right and left side of our medulla. What's interesting about these groups is they're going to stimulate different areas of our or different muscles within our respiratory system. So we're going to have the dorsal groups really stimulating our diaphragm. They are the most active during inspiration, although we do have some that are active during expiration as well. Our ventral respiratory group here is going to be responsible for stimulating our intercostal muscles as well as our abdominal muscles. This group will really be active during both inspiration and expiration. And one thing to mention too is that these two respiratory groups are going to have cross communication that's going to take place between the two, so that our respiratory movements are all symmetrical to one another. Our next respiratory group is our pontine respiratory group, and this was previously called our pneumotaxic respiratory group. And this is a collection of neurons that we're going to have in the pons, whereas our other respiratory group is more in the medulla here. And this is involved with more switching between our inspiration and expiration. We really don't know the true function of these nerve fibers here, but we do know that, and this is kind of illustrated here, that it does have connection to our dorsal and ventral respiratory groups here. So they're going to work in fine-tuning the breathing pattern. So next, let's get into rhythmic ventilation. First, we're going to talk about apnea, and this is when we have a stopping or cessation of breathing. This could be a conscious decision, but eventually we're going to start to build that partial pressure of carbon dioxide within our arterial blood, and it gets so high that our body decides to override our conscious thought, and it's going to cause our respiratory center to override the thought processes happening in our cerebrum, and has our respiratory system kind of take charge. Next, we have hyperventilation, and this is going to cause a decrease in our blood partial pressure of carbon dioxide. We will have vasodilation taking place in our peripheral blood vessels, and this is going to cause a drop in our blood pressure. Because of that drop in blood pressure, we will get a decreased rate in our blood flow to our brain, which reduces the amount of oxygen that's being delivered to our brain, and of course can cause damage or can cause you to pass out or faint. So this is a problem that we can have before diving as well. Now we have our cerebral and limbic system that can affect our respiration as well. This can be voluntarily controlled and modified with our emotions. And next we have our chemical control. So when I say chemical control, I'm really talking about carbon dioxide and oxygen here. Although carbon dioxide is going to be our major regulator, but this is indirectly through our change in pH. So we can have an increase or decrease in our pH, and that can stimulate our chemosensitive areas that we're going to talk about in a moment in our medulla and the carotid body and the aortic bodies, and that's going to cause a greater rate and depth of our respiration. So now let's get into our effects of carbon dioxide. When we have carbon dioxide levels that are elevated, such as during intense exercise, we can have hypercapnia take place. And that's when we have too much or have an elevated level of carbon dioxide. Now we can have the opposite happen as well, like hypocapnia, where we are going to have a lower amount of carbon dioxide than what's normal. Next, we have oxygen. So in hypoxia, we get a decreased amount of oxygen levels than what is normal. So if we have decreases in our partial pressure of oxygen while we keep our pH and partial pressure of carbon dioxide constant, we are going to get an increase in ventilation that's going to occur. So this is a nice summary figure that we have here. If you look at A, where we have our brain pictured here, we are going to have, let me just mention this before we continue. Any of the green lines that you're seeing here, this is representing an increase in ventilation, and anything that has the red arrow is going to mean there's a decrease in ventilation. So these higher centers of our brain that are going to process speech, emotions, voluntary control of breathing, and action potentials in motor pathways, which the later is really dealing with our cerebellum here, that is going to be able to either cause increase or decrease of our ventilation. Next, we have our medullary or chemosensitive area, which would be down in this region. And if we have increase in carbon dioxide levels or a decrease in pH, they kind of go hand in hand, we are going to get an increase in ventilation. And then we have our carotid and aortic chemoreceptors here. If we have an increase in our carbon dioxide, decrease in pH, and a decrease in oxygen, that's going to cause an increase in ventilation. We're going to be talking about these three components in the following slides, so let me just quickly mention them here. We have our Hering-Breuer reflex, in which we are going to have stretch receptors in our lungs to make sure that we don't overinflate our lungs. So when we get to that point where it's too much stretch, we are going to decrease our ventilation. We have some proprioceptors in our muscles and joints. And just to refresh your memory, these proprioceptors are sending sensory information to our brain, telling us where our joints are, where our tendons are in space. So knowing where these muscles are in space. So as we contract them, that is going to cause an increase in our respiratory centers, in our ventilation. So you can imagine when we're exercising, that's going to cause an increase in ventilation. And then we have our receptors for touch, temperature, and pain stimuli that will increase ventilation as well. So let's touch on our chemoreceptors a little bit more. Our chemoreceptors are specialized neurons that are going to respond to changes in chemicals in solution. So any type of chemical we are able to pick up through a chemoreceptor and send that sensory information over to our brain. Now the specific ones we're going to talk about in our respiratory lecture are our central chemoreceptors, which you can see right over here. These are going to be within the medulla oblongata, and they're connected to our respiratory center there too. So we also have these peripheral chemoreceptors, and we've talked about these in our cardiovascular system within our carotid and our aortic bodies, and these are going to sense for changes in carbon dioxide, oxygen, and our pH. So they're connected to our respiratory center through cranial nerves 9, which is our glossopharyngeal nerve, and cranial nerve number 10, which is our vagus nerve. So the most sensitive to our changes in pH and also carbon dioxide is going to be the chemosensitive area in our medulla oblongata. So they're the most important when we are regulating our partial pressure of carbon dioxide and our pH. But this kind of changes depending on what your body is doing. So if you are in an intense exercise mode, then your carotid bodies are going to respond more rapidly to these changes in your pH rather than this chemosensitive area in your medulla. So this is a nice little summary of what we've been discussing. We have your regular blood pH here, and of course we get some drastic change here, not too drastic, but we get an increase in pH here, so our homeostasis is disturbed. Now that chemosensitive area in our medulla is going to detect that change in our blood pH, and this is typically caused because we have a decrease in carbon dioxide, and that is causing a decrease in our breathing. So what we want to do is have some of our effectors go to work, and our effectors in this case are going to include our diaphragm and other respiratory muscles, like our intercostal muscles, and they will work to reduce or slow down their contraction, so that will lower or decrease the rate of breathing or ventilation that's going to take place. By doing this, we increase our carbon dioxide level, which will cause our blood pH to decrease. Now we can have the opposite happen where we have our blood pH decrease, and then we're going to have our medullary chemoreceptors detect this decrease, and we gotta cause an increase in our breathing. That increase in our breathing is going to cause a decrease in our blood carbon dioxide, and that brings our pH level back to its homeostasis level. So now more about this Hering-Breuer reflex. So this is going to limit the depth of our inspiration and prevents overinflation of our lungs. Like I mentioned before, we have stretch receptors within the walls of our bronchi and our bronchioles, so that it'll tell our body, it'll send sensory information to our brain to tell it to not to overinflate and to trigger expiration instead. So in infants, this is really important because it regulates their regular breathing rhythm to prevent overinflation of our lungs. But as an adult, we kind of already know how to regulate that, and instead it's more important when we are regulating the tidal volume, or that normal breathing that we have during exercise. So speaking of exercise, let's go into the effect of exercise on ventilation. So we have two different views here. We have ventilation when we are going to increase it abruptly. When we first start exercising, we start moving our limbs, and that has a strong influence on our ventilation. Now, you can start as kind of a newbie, untrained, and you have a little bit more difficulty getting your rhythm, your ventilation to work properly with your skeletal muscles. But once you are trained, it is a learned pathway that your body syncs your ventilation to the work that your skeletal muscle is doing. So what's happening is during exercise, we have these action potentials that are passed through the nerves in our motor pathways, and they cause our skeletal muscles to contract. And then we have action potentials that are going to be sent over to our respiratory center to kind of sync everything together. So as a summary, what our brain is doing is it is learning to match our ventilation to the intensity or work that we're putting into our skeletal muscles during a specific exercise. And this typically happens around 6 to 8 weeks after training. We start to get more of a sync to our respiratory center and muscular system. So then there's also the case where we have ventilation that is gradually increasing, and we're going to have an immediate increase and gradual increase that's going to occur. That all takes place between 4 and 6 minutes. Now we have this thing called anaerobic threshold, and this is the highest amount of exercise that we can do without significantly changing our blood pH. And of course that gets a little bit better as we become more trained within the exercise that we're doing. Other ventilation modifications are going to be when we have irritants within our nasal cavity. We can have the sneeze reflex take place. If we have irritants within our lungs, we can have the cough reflex take place. And then we also have an increase in our body temperature that will increase ventilation. And this is because our metabolism is elevated, and so we will have more carbon dioxide as a result. And of course, we need to get rid of that carbon dioxide within our body. And then this first bullet point we mentioned on that figure, where activation of touch, thermal, and pain receptors are going to affect our respiratory center as well. All right, we have section 23.8, which discusses more of our respiratory adaptations to exercise. So within athletic training, we are going to have our vital capacity that's going to increase slightly. So I put in this chart again just for us to refresh our memory. Remember that the vital capacity is the amount of air that we can move into and out of our lungs, so completely, forcefully. And the residual volume is going to decrease slightly as well. So the residual volume was that amount of air that after we forcefully exhale all the air out of our lungs, we still have some air within our lungs so that it does not collapse. We're also going to have at our maximal exercise level our tidal volume and minute ventilation that will increase. And our gas exchange between our alveoli and our blood is going to increase. So we're more efficient in exchanging that gas there. And alveolar ventilation is going to increase. Increases in cardiovascular efficiency is leading to a greater blood flow through our lungs. And the last thing we're going to talk about are the effects of aging on our respiratory system. So now we're going to see that our vital capacity and our maximum minute ventilation is going to decrease. And this vital capacity will decrease because we have a lower ability to fill our lungs with air. And we're also having a decreased ability to empty that air out of our lungs as well. So as a result, we get a decreased vital capacity. Our maximum minute volume is going to decrease, and this is because or as a result, we're going to decrease our ability to perform intense exercises. So typically, we recommend that our elderly population do more mild to moderate exercise intensities. And we have a decreased ability to remove mucus from our respiratory passageways, which is going to make it more difficult to breathe. And we have our alveolar ducts and a lot of our larger bronchioles that are going to increase their diameter. And what that does is increase our residual volume, that air that is still left within our lungs. Having these larger bronchioles and alveolar ducts too are going to create more dead space. So we're lowering the chances of gas exchange taking place, and we are reducing the amount of gas exchange that takes place because a lot of our alveolar walls are going to be lost as we age too. So when we reduce or get rid of part of our alveolar walls, it's going to decrease the surface area. Decreased surface area means decrease in gas exchange. So that is it for chapter 23. Please let me know if you have any questions. I know this material is kind of difficult to master, so the sooner you reach out, the better.